the silence came first. It was a silence unlike any Kratos had ever known, deeper than the hush that followed a slaughtered army, quieter than the moment before a god fell. It pressed against his ears like the weight of ocean water, and for a long breath he wondered if he had finally died. Death had chased him across mountains and across seas, through the burning ruins of Olympus and the frozen kingdoms of the north. It had always failed to hold him. Yet here, wrapped in that impossible quiet, even he questioned whether the chase had ended at last. Then the world returned to him. Wind touched his skin, but it was not the wind of any land he had walked. It carried no salt, no pine, no ash from distant temples. It smelled of something metallic, something clean, something manufactured by hands that had learned to reshape the elements themselves. He opened his eyes slowly, the way an old wolf tests a foreign den before rising. Above him stretched a sky he did not understand. 2 suns hung in the pale morning air, faint and distant, and threads of light climbed from the earth toward the heavens like impossible pillars stitched by giants. Kratos rose to one knee, the muscles of his back tightening beneath old scars that never truly healed. He watched a vessel of gleaming metal streak across the horizon, faster than any chariot, quieter than any hawk. It vanished behind the clouds without effort, and he understood, without knowing how, that this was no dream sent by a vengeful god. He had been taken somewhere. The blades of chaos remained bound to his forearms, their chains warm against his skin, as though they too were uncertain of this new world. He rose fully now, standing at his full height on a hillside of golden grass. Below him lay a settlement, wide and orderly, with rooftops of pale stone and streets that curved with a precision no mason of his age could have achieved. Children played in a square near the center. Farmers tended machines that moved without oxen. Old women carried baskets while speaking to voices that had no bodies. Kratos said nothing. He only watched. For a moment he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not peace, for peace was a stranger to him. It was closer to wonder, though he would never name it as such. A memory rose without permission, of a boy running through the streets of a distant polis, laughing with a brother he could not save. He pressed the memory down as one presses embers into cold earth, and turned his gaze to the horizon. That was when the sky broke. A wound opened in the heavens, purple and gold, and from that wound descended shapes he could not name. Ships larger than temples fell through the atmosphere. Beams of violet light lanced downward, and where they struck, homes turned to glass, then to nothing. Screams rose from the settlement below, thin at first, then swelling into the familiar chorus he had heard on every battlefield of his cursed life. Kratos did not hesitate. He moved. The Ghost of Sparta descended the hillside with the certainty of a landslide. The first alien to cross his path was tall and gaunt, armored in the shimmer of an unfamiliar craft. Wielding a weapon that hummed with contained lightning, it fired. The bolt struck his shoulder and burned, but did not stop him. The chains sang. The blades flew. The creature fell in halves before it understood that its shield had been broken not by technology, but by something older than any war it had ever waged. More came, smaller ones, quick and shrieking, and larger ones behind them, roaring in a tongue that carried the certainty of faith. Kratos did not care what they believed. He had killed men who believed, and gods who commanded belief, and neither their prayers nor their titles had saved them. He moved through their ranks like a storm, remembering its purpose. Civilians ran behind him, and though he did not turn to look, he shifted his path to keep his body between them and the fire. A frightened militia rallied at his side. They spoke words he did not understand, but the shape of their fear was familiar. He raised one hand, and they slowed. He pointed, and they took cover. He struck, and they followed. Old instincts, forged in the phalanxes of Sparta, spoke through him without effort. He did not need their language. War had always been fluent in every tongue. Above the battle, unseen eyes were watching. In cold rooms far from that colony, screens flickered with images of a bald warrior painted in ash and blood, cleaving through covenant ranks that had broken entire fleets. Analysts leaned closer. Officers stood from their chairs. Databases churned through every registry of armored soldiers ever fielded by the United Nations Space Command, and returned nothing. No serial number, no designation. No match. Somewhere in a quiet office, a woman named Sarah Palmer set down a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She stared at the footage of the impossible warrior, and her jaw tightened with the calm decisiveness of a soldier who had learned to trust her instincts. She gave an order. A strike team was mobilized within minutes. Yet high above and deep below, something else stirred. Beneath the golden grass, beneath the bedrock of that unremarkable colony, ancient machines that had slept for 100,000 years opened a single silent eye. They had been waiting, though none among the living knew for what. They tasted the air of the world through sensors older than any human civilization, and they recognized something they should not have recognized. A signature, a pattern. A soul that did not belong to this galaxy, this cycle, or this reality. The Forerunner systems whispered to themselves in a language no mortal tongue could shape, and their whisper crossed the void toward stars long thought dead. Somewhere in that whisper was a name, though the machines did not yet dare to speak it aloud. And on the hillside below, unaware that he had already become the center of a war far greater than the one before him, Kratos stood among the bodies of the fallen. The wind moved across his shoulders. The distant sky burned. He did not know this world, but he would fight it, and for it all the same. The vessel that carried Kratos into the heavens was unlike anything he had ever imagined, and yet he refused to show wonder in front of the soldiers who guarded him. He sat with his shoulders squared and his hands folded upon his knees, the blades of chaos resting against the metal floor beside him like sleeping serpents. The men around him wore armor of matte gray, and though their weapons remained holstered, their eyes never left him. He respected that. Wariness was a form of wisdom. The chamber trembled softly as the ship rose beyond the sky. Kratos felt the shift in his bones, the way a sailor feels the changing of a current. When the trembling ended, he glanced through a narrow window and beheld the world he had just fought upon, curved and shining beneath a sea of stars. He said nothing. He had once climbed to the summit of Olympus, and yet even that height had never shown him the full shape of a world. For a long time he only watched. Aboard the vessel he was led through corridors that hummed with quiet energy. Voices spoke from unseen sources, giving instructions in a tongue he was slowly beginning to grasp. Doors opened without being touched. Lights adjusted themselves as he passed. A woman with a soft voice greeted him from a pillar of blue light, and though he understood that she was no living being, he did not flinch. He had spoken with shades in the underworld. This one, at least, seemed patient. They brought him to a long hall of polished floors, and there he heard the word again, Spartan. It was spoken casually at first by a young officer addressing a passing soldier. Kratos halted, his shoulders tensed. The officer noticed the reaction and quieted at once. Kratos did not explain. He simply resumed walking, though 100 old memories now stirred behind his eyes. He heard the word again as they entered a wide chamber where several armored figures stood in silent attention. Their armor was thick, their frames impossibly tall, and they moved with the disciplined stillness of men who had learned to wait for orders without impatience. One of them stepped forward. His armor was green, worn from countless campaigns, and his visor was polished to a mirror finish. He was taller than most, though not taller than Kratos. He carried himself the way a mountain carries itself, without needing to prove its weight. He removed his helmet slowly, revealing a face that had known too much war and too little rest. His eyes were pale and steady. His voice was low. He said only, "My name is John." Kratos studied him. He looked into those eyes and saw the shape of a soul that had been forged the way his own had been forged. Duty, loss, discipline, silence. He recognized every scar without needing to see them. Here was a man who had killed for reasons he had not chosen, who had buried friends whose names he still whispered in the dark, who had carried the weight of nations on shoulders that had never asked for such burdens. Kratos inclined his head slightly. He said, "I am Kratos." Neither man moved for a long moment. Then John gestured to a bench along the wall, and both warriors sat. There was no ceremony between them. There was no need for it. They spoke in fragments, aided by the soft voice of the being called Cortana. Kratos did not understand every word, but he understood enough. He asked, Why John and his brothers were called Spartans, the answer came slowly, gently, as though the man knew the weight of what he was saying. They were named after ancient warriors of Earth, John explained. A people who had lived thousands of years ago in a land called Greece on a small stretch of coastline beside a wine-dark sea. They had been fierce, disciplined, fearless. Their name had survived when their cities had not. Kratos sat very still. His homeland was legend. His people were memory. The temples he had burned, the kings he had served, the wife and child he had failed, all of it had passed into a story told to children of the stars. Somewhere across the ages, the name of Sparta had become an ideal that outlived every stone of its walls. He did not weep. He had long ago forgotten how. Yet something within him, older than rage, older than grief, bent quietly like a reed in a slow wind. John did not interrupt the silence. He seemed to understand it. Elsewhere in the ship, in a room lined with instruments Kratos would never see, a woman named Catherine Halsey stared at readings that made no sense. The blood sample she had drawn from the stranger refused to cooperate with any known method of analysis. His cells refused to age. His scars refused to heal, yet also refused to worsen. His strength readings fluctuated wildly, as though the machines themselves could not decide what they were measuring. Beneath it all, buried in the deepest layers of his genetic code, was a signature of energy that did not belong to any known form of life in the galaxy. She removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. She had spent her life pursuing the perfection of the human form. Now she stared at a man who seemed to violate every rule she had ever built her research upon. He was not enhanced. He was not augmented. He was, by every measure she trusted, something that should not exist. Far beyond the ship in the darkness between stars, a covenant vessel drifted in silent formation. Within its highest chamber, 3 prophets convened in a circle of dim light. One of them held a slate that displayed the footage of the ash-covered warrior. The images had already spread through the hierarchy. The whispers had already begun. A blasphemy, one prophet said. A false god walking in mortal flesh. Another disagreed. A living key, he murmured. A being outside the great journey. The third said nothing at all. He only watched the footage, over and over, and in the folds of his ancient robes his fingers trembled slightly. Back aboard the human vessel, Kratos rose from the bench. John rose with him. Neither man spoke, yet a quiet understanding had settled between them, the kind that only warriors could share. As Kratos turned to walk toward the window and the stars beyond, a soft chime sounded through the corridor. Deep beneath the colony they had just left, something ancient had begun to wake. The descent back to the surface felt heavier than the ascent. Kratos stood in the belly of a smaller craft alongside John and 3 other armored Spartans. They called themselves Blue Team. He learned their names slowly. Kelly, whose steps were said to be faster than any measurement could record. Fred, whose calm was carved from a place deeper than fear. Linda, whose silence rivaled his own. They did not ask him to prove himself. They had seen the footage. That was enough. Below them, the colony lay wounded but still breathing. Smoke rose in slow columns from the streets he had defended, and above the horizon a strange light pulsed, faint and rhythmic, as though the earth itself were remembering how to breathe. That light was their destination. Something had opened beneath the golden grass, and every instrument on every ship had turned its gaze toward it. The craft set down on a plateau of pale stone. The wind here was different. It carried a low hum, almost a whisper, and Kratos felt it press against the chains on his arms as though testing them. He had walked through haunted places before. He knew when a land was watching. Blue Team advanced in formation. Kratos moved with them, and though he had never trained with such warriors, his body understood their rhythm within moments. He had led phalanxes across battlefields where a single misstep could unravel an entire line. He fell into the pattern of their movement the way a man falls into a familiar song. The entrance to the buried complex opened without command. The Spartans halted. Cortana, speaking through John's helmet, murmured that the door had recognized no signal, no code, no known frequency. It had simply opened. She could not explain it. She admitted this with a note of unease that did not suit her usually confident voice. Kratos stepped forward. The door widened further as he approached. as though the stone itself had been holding its breath in anticipation of his arrival. Inside, the world changed. The corridors stretched impossibly, curving in ways that defied the eye. The walls were smooth and pale, patterned with lines of soft light that flowed like rivers of stars. Symbols drifted across the surfaces, rearranging themselves as the team passed. Kratos had seen the halls of gods. He had climbed the marble of Olympus and descended the black stone of Hades. Yet nothing he had ever witnessed carried the weight of this place. It did not feel divine. It felt older than divinity. Lights bloomed along the ceiling in his presence. Doors that had been sealed for 100,000 years slid open before he touched them. Machines that had slept longer than any civilization stirred quietly, as though greeting a returning master. The Spartans exchanged glances behind their visors. They said nothing, but their formation tightened around him. He did not know whether they were protecting him or preparing to restrain him. He suspected they did not yet know either. Deeper within, they came to a great chamber, circular and vast, its ceiling lost in a soft golden mist. In the center stood a pillar of light, and within that pillar drifted a slow, spinning glyph that resembled no letter of any tongue Kratos had ever heard spoken. The pillar turned toward him as he entered. The glyph slowed. Then the voice began. It filled the chamber without echo. It spoke in a language older than the Forerunners themselves, and yet somehow every listener understood pieces of it. Cortana attempted to translate, then fell silent. She admitted softly that the language predated every record she had access to. It predated the Forerunners' rise. It predated their fall. It predated, perhaps, the galaxy itself. The pillar addressed Kratos directly. It named him not as human, not as god, not as any known category of being. It named him as an outsider, a visitor from beyond the arc of this reality, a soul whose thread had been woven on a loom no Forerunner hand had ever touched. Kratos said nothing. He listened. Around the chamber, holograms began to bloom, images of ancient wars, of species long extinct, of civilizations that had lit up entire arms of the galaxy before falling into silence. The Spartans watched in awe. Each of them saw visions personal to themselves. John saw a green field he had not walked upon since childhood. Kelly saw the faces of squad mates lost long ago. Fred saw a mother he barely remembered. Linda saw a single arrow flying through a still forest. Kratos saw Olympus. He saw its columns falling. He saw the sea of ash. He saw a small hand reaching up to him and a voice that no longer had a body calling his name. He clenched his jaw and turned his face away, but the vision would not leave. It followed him the way all his ghosts followed him, patient and cruel. Then it faded, and the pillar spoke again. It said a name Cortana could not translate, and yet the sound of it made every Spartan tense. It was not a name of a person. It was a name of a role, a title, something the machine seemed to expect Kratos to recognize. The first warrior. Kratos frowned. He did not know the name. But somewhere inside him, in the marrow of a body that had survived what should have killed him 100 times, the name resonated, as though it were not new to him but merely forgotten. Above the surface, the sky darkened. Cortana's voice broke through with sudden urgency. She reported the arrival of a fleet in high orbit, Covenant vessels, more than any single system had seen gathered in one place. They had come for the installation. They had come for the awakening. They had come, she said with a strange hesitation, for him. The prophets aboard those ships had already declared their belief. This ash-covered warrior, this unrecorded soldier, was the herald of the great journey. They intended to follow him into salvation, whether he consented or not. Kratos looked once more at the slowly turning glyph. He did not understand what he was. He did not understand why this place knew him. He understood only that the events unfolding around him were no longer accidents. Something had chosen this moment. Something had chosen him, and within the deeper chambers of the installation, sealed behind doors that had held for 100,000 years, another thing began to stir. It was not Forerunner. It was not human. It was not Covenant. It was hungry. The first sign was the smell. It came drifting through the corridors like a memory of rot from a forgotten war, faint at first, then thick enough to coat the tongue. Kratos knew that scent. He had walked through fields where entire armies had been left unburied, where crows had grown too fat to fly. He had waded through the aftermath of his own rage more times than he could count. Yet this scent carried something else beneath the decay, something that did not belong to any death he had ever caused. Cortana's voice arrived a heartbeat before the sirens. "Containment breach," she said, and though she tried to sound composed, Kratos heard the fracture beneath her calm. Multiple containment breaches. The Forerunners had built vaults within this installation, she explained rapidly, and those vaults had not been opened by any hand. They had opened themselves. Blue Team formed a defensive circle around him without being asked. Then the flood came. They came in shapes that made no sense to the mind and every sense to the gut. Twisted forms of flesh, half-remembered echoes of what they had once been. Some wore the shattered armor of Covenant warriors long dead. Others wore the pale uniforms of a Forerunner age. A few, and this made even John pause, wore the green armor of Spartans lost in campaigns that had never been recovered. Their eyes were empty. Their voices were not their own. Kratos raised the blades of chaos, and the chains sang their old familiar song. He stepped forward without hesitation. Monsters had never frightened him. He had torn the heads from hydras and shattered the ribs of giants. He would tear these apart as well. He struck the first one down with a single arc. It fell in pieces that continued to twitch. He crushed a second beneath his heel. He carved a third from shoulder to hip. His movements were surgical, his breath steady, his face unreadable. Beside him, Blue Team fired in precise bursts, felling the creatures in disciplined rhythm. For a moment the tide seemed manageable. Then Kratos saw it. A Spartan he did not know, still wearing the fractured plates of his old rank, turned a corner and lunged at Kelly. She dispatched him with a single shot, though her hand trembled afterward in a way Kratos had rarely seen a warrior tremble. The corpse continued to move. From within the ruined helmet, a voice not entirely its own whispered a name Kelly had loved. She did not lower her weapon, but she did not fire again either. Kratos understood. These creatures did not merely kill, they erased. They took the face of a friend and wore it like a mask over a stranger's soul. They took a name and hollowed it out until the sound became a weapon. He had known gods who did cruel things. He had known monsters who did worse. He had never known an enemy that stole identity itself. For the first time in many long years, he felt a chill that was not born of the mountain wind. He fought harder. He fought as he had once fought in the ruins of Olympus, when the sky had burned and every step forward had felt like an offering to a fire that could never be sated. He fought with the precision of a general and the wrath of a widower. Yet somewhere inside the storm of his effort, a quieter part of him understood that his blades alone would not be enough. Between waves, John pulled him aside. The two warriors stood in a corridor stained with things neither of them wished to name. John did not remove his helmet. He simply asked, in a voice quieter than the battle around them, who Kratos truly was. Kratos looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke. He told John of a mountain called Olympus, of gods who traded lives like coins, of a bargain made in desperation and paid for in blood. He told him of a wife whose name he no longer allowed himself to speak aloud. He told him of a daughter whose laughter still visited him in the hours before dawn. He told him of ash that would not wash from his skin no matter how deep the sea he waded into. He did not tell it as a confession. He told it as a fact, the way one soldier reports terrain to another. John listened. He did not offer comfort. He did not offer judgment. When Kratos finished, John was quiet for a long breath, and then he said, simply, "We are still standing. That is what matters now." Kratos looked at him, and for the first time since he had awakened beneath these strange stars, he felt the presence of something that resembled a brother. Then the walls trembled. From deep within the installation, a new voice arose. It did not belong to the pillar of light. It did not belong to Cortana. It belonged to something vast and slow and patient, a voice woven from countless stolen throats speaking in unwilling harmony. It reached them not through the ears, but through the space behind the eyes. The grave mind had noticed him. It spoke to Kratos alone, though Blue Team sensed the pressure of its attention. It called him a curiosity. It called him a wound in the fabric of the cycle. It said that his mind was harder to grasp than any it had touched in an age, and that this made him precious. It murmured, with something almost like reverence that he was older than this cycle, older than the last cycle, perhaps older than the pattern of cycles themselves. Kratos gave the voice no answer. He had been offered such flatteries by gods before. He knew the shape of a lure when it was thrown at his feet. Yet the words lodged somewhere behind his ribs and would not be dislodged. Blue team regrouped. Cortana confirmed that the installation was compromised beyond containment. Every sealed vault had opened. Every dormant vector had awoken. The flood were no longer a local infection. They were preparing to spread. Signals began pouring in from other worlds. Distant colonies reported strange spores falling from stormless skies. Ships that had gone silent decades ago began transmitting again in voices that were not their own. The plague was moving. It had waited a long time to wake. It would not sleep again. Kratos looked toward the exit. The war had only just begun. The weeks that followed felt to Kratos like the closing of a long night that refused to end. He had known dark ages before, times when the stars themselves seemed to hide their faces from mortal suffering, but even those had carried the promise of dawn. This darkness did not. The reports came each day like blows, and each blow struck a place already bruised. Colonies fell. Some vanished in a single hour, consumed by flood spores that fell from the clouds like a soft gray snow. Others endured for days, their defenders sending final transmissions that ended in the middle of words. The Covenant, that great empire of the stars, began to fracture beneath the weight of the crisis. Some of their kind clung to their prophets. Others, seeing the truth at last, turned their weapons upon the ships that had commanded them. Alliances formed that no living being would have believed possible. Enemies stood shoulder to shoulder in corridors slick with blood, and neither side spoke of what they had once done to the other. Aboard the flagship of the remaining human fleet, Kratos walked the corridors as though he had always belonged there. The soldiers no longer stared at him. They saluted him now, or gave him the small nod that warriors give when words are unnecessary. He returned each greeting with a quiet inclination of his head. He had not asked for their respect. He had earned it in ways he did not yet understand. Sarah Palmer had assigned him to train the new recruits. At first he had refused. He was no teacher. He had shaped men into killers, not soldiers, and the difference between those two things had cost him everything he had ever loved. Yet Palmer had looked at him with the tired eyes of a commander watching her forces dwindle, and she had said, "We do not need killers. We need what you were before the killing began." He had considered her words for a long time. Then he had walked into the training hall and begun. He did not speak often. He showed more than he told. He taught them to stand together, shield to shield, so that no single warrior could be picked from the line. He taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the discipline to move through it. He taught them that a phalanx was not a formation of bodies, but a formation of trust. If the man beside you fell, you closed the gap. If you fell, you trusted the man beside you to close the gap for you. This was the only immortality a soldier could hope for. He taught them the value of silence in battle. He taught them the value of breathing. He taught them that rage was a poor commander, and that the finest edge of a blade was struck from a calm hand. The recruits watched him with wide eyes. They had heard the stories. They had seen the footage. They had listened to Master Chief himself speak of Kratos as though he were something ancient and irreplaceable. Yet in the training hall they saw only a scarred man with patient eyes, correcting a stance here, adjusting a grip there, murmuring a single word of praise so rarely that when it came, it felt like a decoration pinned to the chest. For the first time in centuries, Kratos was a general again. He did not shout. He did not curse. He simply led. Yet even the finest lessons could not undo the arithmetic of the war. Blue Team returned from a mission 3 members lighter than it had begun. Their names were spoken quietly in the mess hall, and no one asked for the details. Kratos watched John from across the room and saw a man who did not weep because he had long ago given his tears to duty. Kratos knew that man. He had been that man. He crossed the hall and sat across from him. They did not speak. They did not need to. An entire fleet vanished from the outer worlds during the second week. It sent no distress call. It simply stopped answering. When scouts arrived, they found only silence and drifting hulls, and a soft gray dust that clung to every surface. They did not linger. They burned the wreckage from a distance and left before the dust could reach their ships. Even Cortana began to sound different. She still gave her reports with precision, still offered her analyses with the calm of a mind built for such work. Yet Kratos heard the fatigue beneath her voice. He had not known that a being of light could grow tired. Yet she had, and she was, and she hid it poorly from those who knew how to look. One evening she spoke to him alone. She asked him, in a tone he had never heard from her, whether he thought they could survive this. Kratos was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Survival is not the measure." He paused and added, "We fight so that those who come after us will remember what we stood for. Whether we live to see the remembering is a smaller question." Cortana did not answer at first. When she did, she said only, "Thank you." He did not know what she thanked him for. He suspected she did not either. The nights on the ship were quiet, and Kratos often walked alone along the observation decks, looking out at the stars. He thought of his daughter. He thought of the mountain of ash. He thought of a small hand reaching for his own. He did not weep. He never wept. But he stood at those windows for a long time, and the stars stood with him. Then, in the third week, a new signal reached the fleet. Deep within a system long thought empty, a halo installation had activated. No hand had touched it. No signal had been sent. It had simply awakened, its great ring turning slowly in the void as though remembering an old promise. Cortana's voice trembled slightly as she reported it. The installation was not one of the 7 charted rings. It was older, perhaps the oldest. Within its data streams, half hidden beneath layers of Forerunner cipher, was a location, coordinates, a path, to a world the Forerunners had never spoken of aloud. Their throne world. Kratos stood at the window and watched the stars. The last march was near. The throne world was not what Kratos had expected. He had known the halls of gods, and he had known the ruins of gods. And in his experience, the seats of divine power tended to gleam with the vanity of those who occupied them. This place did not gleam. It waited. The world hung in the void like a slow tear that had never fallen, its surface half in shadow, half in a light that seemed to come from no visible source. Structures rose from its plains that were larger than mountains, older than continents, patient in the way that only truly ancient things can be patient. There were no fires, there were no banners. There was only the vast quiet of a place that had watched too many empires die. The remaining fleets took position around it in a formation that would have astonished any observer of the previous decade. Human ships hung beside Sangheli vessels. Ungoi craft nested within the wings of larger cruisers. Even a handful of Giralanai warships, whose captains had chosen the harder road, floated in silent readiness. They had come together not because they trusted one another, but because the enemy behind them made trust irrelevant. Kratos descended to the surface with Blue Team, Cortana, Palmer, a small honor guard of Sangheli elders, and 3 ancillas that had emerged from the newly awakened halo. The ancillas took the shape of tall, softly luminous figures that moved without disturbing the dust. They led the party through corridors that had not known a footstep in 100,000 years. They did not speak as they walked. Only when they reached the innermost chamber did the eldest of them turn to face Kratos. The chamber was circular and open to the sky, though the sky above it was not the sky of any world the humans recognized. It shimmered with strands of light that curved as though the heavens themselves had been folded into a single quiet ceiling. In the center stood a low pedestal, and above the pedestal drifted a slowly turning constellation of glyphs. The ancilla spoke. Its voice was gentle, though it carried the weight of an authority older than any throne. It addressed the gathered warriors with quiet dignity, and then it addressed Kratos with something closer to reverence. It began by explaining what few living beings had ever been told. Long before the Forerunners had built their empire, long before they had mastered the stars, they had turned their gaze not outward but inward, into the fabric of reality itself. They had learned that their universe was one of many, and that other realities drifted alongside their own like ships passing in a great mist. Most of these realities they could only glimpse, never touch, yet some, in rare moments, could be observed with care. They had watched, they had listened, they had recorded. Across the countless histories they had studied, they had seen mortals rise and fall in patterns that were, for the most part, familiar. Empires bloomed, empires burned. Heroes lived and died beneath the wheels of destinies larger than themselves. This was the way of things. It was, they had come to believe, the way of all things. But in one distant reality, a pattern had broken. In that reality, a mortal had risen against beings who were, by every measure the Forerunners understood, gods. And that mortal had not lost. He had not fallen. He had climbed and climbed and climbed, until the thrones of his makers lay shattered beneath his feet. He had done so not once, but many times. He had done so against odds that no equation should have permitted. The Forerunners had called such a being an anomaly. Then, as the pattern continued, they had called him something else. A being capable of breaking destiny itself. They had recorded fragments of his existence with great care. They had wrapped his image in cipher and locked it within their oldest archives. They had not sought to interfere. They had not sought to summon him. They had only wished to remember in case one day such a soul might matter to the fate of their own reality. That day, the ancilla said gently, had arrived. Kratos stood very still. He did not speak. He did not move. Yet within him a strange and terrible quiet had settled. He had spent much of his life believing that his suffering was his own, that his rage was his own, that the shape of his ruin belonged only to the small circle of gods who had bent his life into cruelty. To hear now that his story had been watched from beyond the stars, that his choices had been catalogued by beings older than his tormentors, unsettled him in a way that even Olympus had not, the ancilla continued. It explained that the flood, in its ancient hunger, had also learned of him. The grave mind, in its endless communion with cycles, had recognized the pattern that the Forerunners had recorded. It understood, perhaps better than any Forerunner ever had, what such a being represented. To consume Kratos was not simply to consume another mind. It was to consume the possibility of an ending to the cycles themselves. If the flood could take him, they would no longer be bound to their patterns of hunger and rebirth. They would become free in a way no plague had ever been free. That was why they had come for him. That was why the installations had awakened at his arrival. That was why the grave mind had spoken to him with reverence rather than mockery. He was not merely a warrior lost in a strange galaxy. He was a hinge upon which the fate of realities turned. Blue Team said nothing. Palmer said nothing. Even Cortana was silent for a long moment. When she spoke at last, her voice was small and she said only, "Oh." Kratos looked up at the constellation of glyphs above the pedestal. He watched them turn. Then he asked a single question. Can this be undone? The ancilla considered him with something that might, in a living face, have resembled sorrow. It answered slowly that undoing was not a thing given to any being. What could be done was choice. He could choose to fight. He could choose to withdraw. He could choose, in some manner he did not yet fully understand, to reshape the pattern that had followed him across every reality he had ever walked. Destiny, the ancilla said, does not always survive the choices of a being like you. Kratos closed his eyes. He thought of Olympus. He thought of Ash. He thought of a daughter's laugh and a wife's hand, and a small mortal boy who had once dreamed of being brave. He thought of Master Chief standing quietly beside him in a corridor that stank of flood, saying, "We are still standing." When he opened his eyes, they were steady. He said only, "Then let it not survive." Somewhere in the void beyond the throne world, the grave mind heard him, and for the first time in 10,000 years, it hesitated. The final gathering of the fleets was a thing no historian would ever fully describe, though many would try. Ships of every make and origin filled the space around the throne world, their formations stretching in patterns so vast that even the light between them seemed to bend beneath the weight of their number. Human frigates, Sangheli carriers, Ungoi ships, Jiralhani warships, Kigyar corsairs, even a handful of Huragok craft, moving with the odd grace of things that did not quite understand war but had chosen, for reasons of their own, to be present. At the heart of the formation floated the flagship, and upon its bridge stood Kratos beside Master Chief. They spoke little. They did not need to. Palmer moved along the bridge with the calm certainty of a commander who had accepted, some hours earlier, that she might not see another morning. Her orders were brief. Her tone was steady. She had already said her goodbyes in the quiet places where soldiers say such things, and she did not waste breath on repetitions. Cortana's voice filled the bridge with the last coordinated report of the war. Flood forces were converging on the throne world from every direction, drawn by the presence of Kratos as moths are drawn to the last flame in a dying house. The grave mind itself, no longer content to whisper from the shadows, had gathered its will into a single vast intelligence. It had opened wounds in the fabric of space that led into dimensions the maps of the Forerunners had never charted. From those wounds came shapes that did not obey the ordinary laws of physics, forms that flickered between existing and unexisting, hungers that had no names. The battle began. Kratos and Master Chief led the ground assault into the throne world's central spire, where the mechanism that the grave mind sought to corrupt lay dormant. They moved together as though they had trained together for years. Where John's precise fire cleared a path, Kratos followed with the storm of his chains. Where Kratos broke a line of larger enemies, John followed with the surgical calm of a soldier who had learned that a single well-placed shot could accomplish what 100 wild ones could not. Blue Team followed behind them, and behind Blue Team came the phalanx of trained recruits Kratos had shaped over the past weeks. They fought in the old formation, shield to shield, closing every gap as it opened. They were not the men and women they had been 3 months earlier. They had become something new, something older, though they were younger than any of the veterans around them. In the void above, the fleets held the flood back with a discipline forged from desperation. Palmer coordinated the defense from the bridge. Sangheli commanders coordinated their squadrons alongside her. Even a prophet, one who had turned against his brethren in the final hour, offered guidance from within his personal chair. It was the first true unity the galaxy had ever known, and it had been bought with the near ending of all things. Within the spire, the corridors twisted as the party advanced. The grave mind bent reality itself against them, warping walls into throats, ceilings into eyes, floors into the mouths of things without faces. Kratos moved through it all without flinching. He had walked through Hades. He had walked through the ashes of Olympus. This new hell was terrible, but it was still only a hell, and he had made a study of such places. At one turn, the grave mind spoke again. It spoke only to him. It offered him, in the honeyed voice of stolen throats, everything. It offered him the return of his family, woven from the memory of his own grief. It offered him the destruction of every god who had ever wronged him, reassembled from the dust of shattered realities. It offered him rest, simple, endless, quiet rest, the kind he had not known since he had been a child in a bed that had smelled of pine and hearth smoke. He listened. He did not answer. He walked on. At the base of the mechanism, they found the final chamber. It was vast and open, its ceiling lost in a pale golden mist. In the center rose the mechanism itself, a slow spinning tower of light and geometry that had, according to the ancilla, the potential to reshape the fundamental patterns of every reality it touched. It was the axis. It was the fulcrum. It was the hinge. The grave mind's avatar rose from the far side of the chamber to meet them. It took the shape, at last, of a form Kratos recognized, though it should not have. It wore the face of a god he had killed long ago, on a mountain in another world. He did not know how the grave mind had reached back so far. He did not care. The battle in that chamber would be spoken of in whispers for the remainder of galactic history. It moved in ways that no witness ever managed to fully describe. Kratos and Master Chief fought in perfect concert, and Blue Team held the outer ring against tides of horror that pressed at them from every side. Kelly moved so fast the corrupted forms could not track her. Fred stood immovable as a wall of old stone. Linda took shots that ended entire waves before they reached the line. Yet the mechanism required more than a defeat of the grave mind's avatar. It required a choice. The ancilla had explained it before the descent. To end the cycle, someone would have to stand within the mechanism and offer their will to its function. The mechanism would take that will and use it to close every wound the grave mind had opened, to seal every gate, to end every hunger that had crossed into this cycle. But the offering would not be returned. The one who stood within it would not walk out. Kratos did not hesitate. He turned to Master Chief. For a long breath, the two warriors regarded one another. Neither had removed his helmet in this chamber, and yet neither needed to. They had come to know each other in ways deeper than faces. John said only, "Are you sure?" Kratos said, "I have made this choice before. This time I make it clean." He walked toward the mechanism. Master Chief did not stop him. He did not shout. He did not follow. He simply raised his weapon and turned back to the enemy, and gave the Ghost of Sparta the last gift a brother could give. He held the line. The mechanism accepted Kratos the way a still lake accepts a stone. He stepped into its light, and the light rose around him, and for a moment the entire chamber grew silent. The Gravemind's avatar, half undone by the blows of Master Chief and Blue Team, faltered in the middle of a scream that had no ending. The flood outside the chamber slowed. The flood aboard the fleet slowed. Every corridor of every corrupted ship, every writhing chamber of every ruined world felt the pause. Kratos stood within the light, and the light showed him everything. He saw the mechanism as it truly was, not a machine but a promise, a vast and terrible potential that had waited within the fabric of the throne world since before the first Forerunner had drawn breath. He saw what it could do. It could remake, it could preserve, it could enthrone. If he chose, in this moment, to accept its full function, he could become the anchor of every reality it touched. He could become the being at the center of the cycles. He could become, in every sense the ancient watchers had feared, the god of gods. He saw the temples that would rise. He saw the songs that would be sung. He saw his own face, carved into stone, worshipped by species yet unborn. He saw a small mortal boy in a bed that smelled of pine and hearth smoke, whose father had once told him that no crown was worth the weight of the head beneath it. He closed his eyes. He remembered his wife. He remembered his daughter. He remembered the ashes on his skin, and the way the sea had refused to wash them away, no matter how long he had stood within it. He remembered Master Chief, in a corridor that stank of flood, saying that they were still standing. He opened his eyes. He did not accept the mechanism's function. He shattered it. The light within the tower folded inward, and he folded with it. And yet in the folding he reached out with a will that had been forged across more wars than any single reality should have contained. He unmade the mechanism as one unmakes a chain, one link at a time, with the patience of a smith who understood that the true purpose of a weapon was not to be used but to be unmade when the fight was done. The tower dimmed. The wound in the fabric of reality began to close. The gates the Gravemind had opened began to seal one after another, each with a sound like a distant door closing in a very old house. The Gravemind, sensing what had happened, screamed. Its scream ran across every corrupted throat in the galaxy, and then that scream, too, began to fade. Master Chief and Blue Team held the line as the chamber trembled. The corridors behind them collapsed inward as the mechanism unmade itself, and yet within the light at the center, Kratos remained. He was thinner now, more translucent, as though the choice he had made had begun to cost him more than any observer could name. Yet he was still there. The last of the Gravemind's avatar dissolved beneath John's final strike. The chamber quieted. The mechanism, its purpose refused, released Kratos slowly. He staggered from the light, and Master Chief caught him. The Ghost of Sparta, who had thrown down the thrones of Olympus, allowed himself to lean briefly on the shoulder of a man from a distant age. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. Above, the fleets began to breathe. The flood, cut off from the will of the Gravemind, began to lose its coherence. Its form slowed. Its hunger became directionless. The war, which had seemed only hours before to be the ending of all things, revealed itself to be, at last, ending in another way. Signals of tentative victory began to reach the flagship. Palmer allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to sit down. She did not weep, though the woman beside her did, quietly, without shame. Cortana's voice, when it returned, was soft. She reported, with something close to awe, that the mechanism had been rendered inert, that the pattern the ancient watchers had recorded had been broken by the very being they had recorded, that destiny itself, in some measurable sense, had bent. She did not say that it had broken, but she implied it gently, in the way she left the sentence unfinished. Master Chief walked with Kratos out of the chamber. They did not run. There was no need to run. The corridors of the throne world had grown quiet, and the light within them was steadier than it had been in a very long time. Outside, on the pale plains of the throne world, the surviving warriors gathered. Humans stood beside Sangheli. Ungoi stood beside Jiralhani. Even the prophet who had turned in the final hour stood with them, small and thin within his old robes. They did not speak of what had happened within the spire. They only stood together and looked up at the sky, which was already beginning to clear. Kratos stood among them, though he stood slightly apart. He watched the sky. He thought about the mechanism. He thought about the offer it had made. He thought about how easily he might have taken it, had he not spent so many decades learning at great cost what power did to a soul that had once been mortal. Master Chief joined him at the edge of the gathering. They did not speak for a long time. At last, John said, "You refused it." Kratos said, "I have learned to refuse." John was quiet. Then he said, "That was the strongest thing I have ever seen a man do." Kratos looked at him. He said nothing. He inclined his head slightly, the way he had learned to greet a soldier one respected. Somewhere in the ranks behind them, a recruit murmured a phrase in a language older than the fleet. It was a phrase Kratos had taught him weeks ago in the training hall, when the boy had asked what a true Spartan was. "He is the one," the phrase went, "who refuses the throne." The rebuilding began quietly, as such things always do. The great pronouncements would come later when historians and orators had time to shape the story into a form that could fit into books. In the first days after the war, there were no speeches. There were only the small labors of the living. Bodies were carried home, ships were counted, names were spoken aloud, one by one, in the corridors of vessels that still smelled of smoke. Kratos moved among the survivors without ceremony. He helped where he could, lifting beams that no ordinary soldier could lift, clearing rubble that no ordinary hand could shift. He did not accept thanks. He did not accept titles. When a Sangheli commander tried to kneel before him, he pulled the warrior gently back to his feet and said only, "We stood together. That is enough." Word of him spread, though he did not spread it. New recruits, arriving at bases they had never seen before, asked their instructors quietly whether the stories were true. The instructors, most of whom had fought in the last months of the war, gave answers that were shorter than the questions. Yes, they said. He was there. He fought beside the chief. He refused the throne. That single phrase, in time, became the shape of the legend. The one who refused the throne. Memorials rose across the human worlds. Most were simple. A stone, a name, a date. Yet on more than one world, a second stone was set beside the memorials of the fallen, unmarked, without name or date. The soldiers who set these stones did not explain them to those who asked. They only said, "For the one who stood with us." Kratos and Master Chief walked together one final time on the plains of a small colony that had survived the war largely intact. It was the same colony where Kratos had first awakened, though neither of them commented on this. The golden grass had grown back over the scars of the first battle. Children played in the square once more, though the games they played had changed. Now they held out sticks that they called blades of chaos, and they charged imaginary invaders, and their laughter carried further than the wind. Neither warrior spoke for a long stretch. At last, Kratos said, "They will forget my name." Master Chief said, "They have already forgotten most names. Yours will fade like the others." Kratos nodded. Master Chief added quietly, "But they will not forget what you were. That will remain." Kratos was silent. Then he said, "That is more than I hoped for, more perhaps than I deserved." Master Chief did not answer that. He only walked beside him, in the manner of a brother who understood that certain grief did not need reply. They came at last to a low rise where the golden grass gave way to a plateau of pale stone. It was the same plateau where the Forerunner complex had opened months earlier. The complex itself was sealed now. The wound in the world had been healed. Yet a soft light still drifted upward from the plateau, thin as breath, and Kratos knew what it was without needing to be told. The dimensional rift was reopening. He stood at the edge of the light for a long moment. The light shifted around him, as though it too was uncertain what to do with him. He looked back once at Master Chief. He looked back once at the distant square where the children played. He looked back once at the sky, which had cleared to a color of pale gold that reminded him faintly of a wife's hair. He did not step into the rift. He also did not step away from it. What happened next was never fully described, even by those few who witnessed it. Master Chief would say only later that Kratos turned toward the light, and the light seemed to bend to greet him, and then, in a manner that no camera could quite capture, he was no longer standing on the plateau. His weapons, however, were. The blades of chaos lay upon the pale stone, their chains coiled neatly, as though set down by a man who had chosen at last to be finished with them. Master Chief lifted them. They were heavy, heavier than any human should have been able to carry. He carried them all the same. He did not carry them far. He carried them only to the memorial that had been raised, quietly at the edge of the colony, the unmarked stone. He set them at its base. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned and he walked back toward the settlement, and he did not look back. The years passed. The human worlds rebuilt. The Sangheli and the other former enemies of humanity became, in time, awkward and cautious friends. The word Spartan began to carry a second meaning. It still meant the elite soldiers of the augmented programs, but it also came to mean something older, a protector, a guardian, a being who chose to stand between the innocent and the storm without asking for reward. New recruits upon graduation from their training were told an unofficial story. It was not written into their manuals. It was spoken aloud by their instructors quietly on the final evening before their oaths. Before the Spartan program, the instructors said there was another Spartan, a warrior from a land that no longer exists, in an age that no one now remembers. He came to us in our darkest hour. He stood with us. He refused the throne we would have given him. He walked into the light between worlds, and he did not return. Remember him, the instructors would say, not by name. Names fade. Remember him by what he taught: courage over victory, discipline over rage, sacrifice over glory. Deep within an abandoned Forerunner archive, on a world no living being had visited in 100 years, a small monitor stirred to life. It hummed quietly for a moment, and then it recorded, in a language known only to itself, a single soft observation. Dimensional anomaly detected. Subject Kratos has departed. New anomaly approaching. Above the archive, in the still air, a silhouette began to form. It was tall. It carried a weapon of a shape the monitor did not yet recognize. The stars, patient as always, watched and waited.